Hi there, my name's Adam Fielding, and welcome to another one of these streams where I'm going to be covering the past 4 weeks of music making sessions and kind of have a look at what I've actually been doing and how these tunes turned out, what I've changed, what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them, all that kind of stuff. So interestingly, I haven't actually looked at any of these tunes since I wrote them. I bounced them out and I haven't actually opened up any of these documents, which is super interesting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn down the maximizer on the output so I can actually talk over what's actually going on. Some interesting talk going on in the chat about rack extensions. So I was just showing off something, another track that I was working on, which happened to use an Access Virus. Then I was started talking about the VK2. So talk has naturally turned to the VK2. So anyway, this particular tune is Phoenix Sunrise, which I wrote about a month ago now. And this was quite interesting because I decided to write a tune that used nothing but Reason stock devices and samples, which I hadn't actually done in ages. And this was kind of interesting, and I'm going to play it first, and then I'm going to talk a bit about it afterwards and kind of all the things I changed after the stream, and then kind of go into what I would have done differently if I had more time and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to play it, and I'm going to hang out in the chat for a little bit. And if anyone has any questions about this particular track, or they want me to kind of dip in and explain anything, I'd be more than happy to do so. So here we go. So that was Phoenix Sunrise, which was written when it was, I think, when we just had the start of our little heat wave over here in the UK. And that was a lot of fun to work on. And as a couple of people have pointed out in the chat, it was an interesting use of the monotone here. So it's the monotone bass synth, which was introduced in Reason, was it introduced in Reason 11 or 10? Either way, I decided to use it as not a bass synth and just use it as a lead, which is this little thing here that kind of comes in. So that was a lot of fun, and I love doing that with synths that kind of label themselves as one particular thing to use them as something else and kind of recontextualize them is always fun. So I highly recommend doing that if there's a synth that you like the sound of and you've kind of thought to yourself, maybe if I tweaked it or something like that. There's a really cool trick that by a band called Triphonic, which is, I believe it's mainly Brian Tryphon, and he released an album in 2008, I think, called Emergence, and there's a particular track on there called Parks on Fire, and there's a really gnarly sort of distorted bass sound, and he created that by, well, it's a sort of crackling, not so much bass, but it was created from a bass, I think. And he basically took a sound and put it through an auto-tuner, but set the auto-tuner several octaves higher than it should have been. So it was kind of freaking out trying to pitch correct this thing. And it sounds really, really cool. And it's a really good instance of someone using a particular effect or a particular device for something that it's totally not intended for. And I love that kind of stuff, just creating something. And I think the earlier versions of Reason in particular kind of lent themselves well to this way of thinking, because a lot of the times you had to find workarounds to do stuff. Whereas nowadays, there are generally devices that kind of do most of what you want to be able to do. So a good example of that, which is going off on a bit of a tangent here, which I tend to use reasonably frequently, is if I'm working with acoustic drums and I want to use a sample trigger, instead of using a VST or something like Slate Trigger, if I wanted to use something else, I tend to use the pulverizer. So if I fire up an instance of the pulverizer here, not hook it up to anything, you can hook devices up to the pulverizer and how did I do this? I've just realized I'm talking about this, but I can't actually remember how I did this. So so if you hook up the modulation output, so if I were to create an instance of a redrum for argument's sake, you can hook up the follower output to a gate input on the redrum. So every time the follower is triggered on the pulverizer here by some kind of external sample source, some sort of external sound source in the input, then that will trigger kick 1. So if you have, for example, a kick channel and you want to trigger a kick sample over the top of that, you could route the kick channel to the pulverizer, and then the follower output would trigger the redrum input, which is super nice. So if I'm just thinking of, do I have a channel I could do? Actually, I could just use it with the kick in this track. So if I just find the drums, they're over here, and I'm pretty sure have I split the kick? I have, yes, brilliant. So I'm going to take the kick, it's already going from channel 1 into the Spider audio splitter. So I'm going to take that channel and route it into the input on this pulverizer, which I've just created. And now every time I play a kick, it triggers, if you look here on Redrum 2, it triggers that empty slot there, which is really useful because you don't have to use this with any sequence parts. This is just audio that's working here. So if I were to load a sample, like if I just load that little stab there and create a mix channel for that particular redrum device, which is really, really useful. So another thing I tend to do is sort of semi-related, is if I want to layer stuff up using the redrum, you can just take the gate output and route it to the gate input of a separate channel. That way you don't have to create extra triggers in the sequencer lane. You can just trigger one individual note and it will trigger several of them. So that's really useful, especially if you're working mainly with audio. And again, for acoustic drums, it's super useful if you have a live drum recording and you want to add some extra drum triggers over the top. It's a really neat way of doing it. So it's not really the kind of thing that Pulverizer was designed for. It's a distortion device, but because it's got some clever CV inputs and outputs on the back, you can use it for a multitude of additional purposes, and I really like that about Reason. That's kind of one of the things that really appeals to me about it. So I'm going to get rid of those. And have I just got rid of all of the drums? No. Excellent. Right. So there are several other. Buskin Bills has just said, is that the only device in Reason that can do that? I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure there are other ways of triggering samples with audio, possibly. That just happened to be the first one I thought of at the time. But there are several other instances where there's like little tricks that you can kind of mess around with in Reason using the CV routings. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, unfortunately. But I seem to remember there was one particular, before the days of grain or any kind of audio recording, there was a way you could kind of do semi-granular stuff by automating the start value of an NN19 and just triggering it like repeatedly, which is kind of a pretty common trick with older samplers, but it was kind of neat. So one thing I did want to talk about was how I'm using the maximizer and how I'm using that to set my levels correctly when I finish a track. So with these live streams, what I found is that because I'm using a very similar setup with all of these streams, I've just been doing this very kind of simple trick, then it's kind of resulted in me having reasonably consistent levels across the board. So if I play the busiest part of the track now, which I think is around block 2. There we go. So I think that this is the busiest part of the track. So originally I did have the input gain turned up to about, I think it was like 4.5 dB or something. So if I do that again, you'll notice the limiter is just kicking in on the input, which is exactly where I want it. So that's kind of a very rough visual reference that I use when I'm setting the levels after I finish the track, when I come back to it the following day. And I think I just want to bring things up a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll literally just keep that open in the rack and go to the mixer and just highlight all the channels and just bring them up slowly until that just kicks in on the busiest part of the track. And that tends to be kind of a good sort of just a really rough way of getting a sort of a level that I'm happy with, that sits nicely with the other tracks. It's not what I typically do when I'm working on my own stuff outside of the streams. I tend to use R128, which I've mentioned before, which provides you with LUFS measurements and that kind of thing. So that gives you a better idea of what's going on. But at the end of the day, I mean, if it sounds right to your ears, that's the important thing. But having a rough measurement to start with is also quite useful. But I found that this technique works quite nicely with the streams, and because I'm using the M-Class maximizer and the same drum setup in all of these streams, it tends to be quite consistent. So I've just stuck to doing that. So on top of that, once I'd done that, I kind of started messing around with individual levels and whatnot. One thing I did do was I added a little cheeky acoustic guitar loop to this track. So if I go back, it's not that one. Where is it? Acoustic guitar. So I'm not going to lie, that sounds kind of crap on its own, but in the context of the mix, I felt like that particular part of the track needed something extra, and I wanted to stick with using stuff from the factory sound bank, and it had been a while since I'd used those. So interestingly, I don't tend to use the Dr. Octo Rex as an 8-loop machine very often. I tend to just use it with 1 loop. So this was kind of an interesting, I decided to use two different loops here, 2 different guitar loops from the factory sound bank. One which I just one I transposed to kind of get to the necessary chord that was actually playing at the time, and then I'd switch to another loop altogether, and that kind of matches. So that's why there's all this crazy automation going on here, even though it's just 2 loops. One is to transpose the first loop, and the second curve is to switch to the second loop. So that's set to number 2. So yeah, Diastro said, do you play guitar, Adam? I would probably play that over the Octo Rex thing. See, this is what I was going to get into. So if I were to work on this track from scratch, like, I think this is a really neat idea, and as a track and kind of a proof of concept, I thought it was, I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I think it's really cool. But ultimately, if I were to mess around with this track and start bringing in external elements, I think it would benefit immensely from me doing that. I'd say it's one of the live stream tracks that would definitely benefit the most from that. Like, I like the feel of it, and I like that it has that kind of early noughties feel to it. But, sorry, Drabbits just said in the chat, I walked out to refill my coffee and I came back to a coffee shop and Diastro has said, you said refill. Yes, that reminds me of every time it happened several times on the old Reason, on the Propellered user forum. Every time someone would say, oh, for some reason, did you have to follow it up with, pun not intended or something, which didn't get old ever. It's just, reason is a word, you can use it. So so one thing I would have changed absolutely if I were to work on this track some more is I would totally take out that guitar loop. I would also, I like the bass, but I feel like I could play that live as well. That'd be kind of neat. It'd be interesting to work with some different kind of background samples, although I really like how some of these turned out. Like, I mean, that to me just kind of screams like early noughties sort of loungy kind of stuff, which is exactly what I was going for. But yeah, some of the loops I would have switched out. I actually quite liked how the this bus thing turned out. Like, I think delay helped a lot there. But again, if I were to start switching stuff out, and I think this is the case with a lot of my live stream stuff, I would possibly, instead of using the echo, I might consider using Valhalla delay because I just prefer how it sounds, to be honest. Nothing against the echo because I think it's a perfectly decent delay unit and I've had tons of use out of it. But I really liked the Valhalla delay. It just has a particular like character. I'm just going to fire it up so I can sort of show it off. I think this is the acoustic guitar. So I'm just going to bypass the echo and just get a rough kind of approximation going. So I'm just going to fire this up to my standard settings. So this is a tape delay, and I'm just going to turn up the feedback, and this is what that sounds like. So it's really, really cool. Diastro has asked, did you share the Reason file on this track? I did, and again, I don't have the link handy. So if anyone has the link to my Dropbox folder handy kicking around anywhere, please feel free to drop it into the chat because I meant to make a note of it and I forgot. But basically, yeah, all of my live stream projects are in a Dropbox folder now, so you can just go in there and grab them. And if you want to check out this track, it's all there. And you don't need any external refills or rack extensions to open it, which is really neat if you have Reason 11 Suite. I think the only thing you'll be missing if you don't have Suite is the electric bass. So you can still open most of it up. Oh, and yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think everything else is there. So yeah, I really, really like Valhalla delay. Like I actually got in touch with Valhalla just before it came out because they mentioned they were working on a delay, and I was like, oh crap, Valhalla were working on a delay. I'd heard a couple of audio examples and I was like, wow, I'd love to try this out, and I sort of figured maybe they needed someone to just make sure it worked in Reason basically. So I reached out and said, hey, do you need someone to test it in Reason? And they said sure. So they sent it over and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I've been using it pretty much as my delay more or less exclusively ever since, outside of these sessions where I'm using the echo or if I'm using something else. But yeah, it's really, really neat. It has several different modes that you can switch to, so they all have their own unique character. Then you can set the era of the delay unit, and it's super customizable, and I love it. Although I must admit, most of the time I do just stick to the tape mode because it sounds awesome. On the track I was just working on, I think I used one instance where I was using digital delay, which just generally sounds kind of cleaner, and yeah, but it sounded great, so I just ran with it. And yeah, it's great. So yeah, that's another thing I would have changed. I would change if I were to kind of come back to it. So I also, unfortunately, I realized that my vocals weren't really cutting it in this track, which was a bit of a bummer. Someone mentioned that you saw my guitar skills during last week's stream. Well, the skills is a strong word there, I feel. That went horrendously wrong. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, because that's actually, I feel like last week's stream touched upon some really interesting sort of topics in terms of creative flow and feel. And that's something I really want to touch on, to some of the more sort of philosophical creative stuff. But in terms of practicality, that vocal sounded kind of crap. So there was no amount of me messing around with that was going to sound convincing, so I decided to layer it up with an instance of Humana. And And that kind of helped to cover up the fact that it doesn't sound even remotely convincing. But again, I feel like if I would just re-record that. So, yeah. Buskin Bills has said during last week's stream, the first take was the best, Adam. Yeah, I'm really annoyed I didn't record that. So annoyed. It wasn't even that complicated. Like, it was literally just one string and I was just kind of noodling. But I really wish I'd recorded it, because I feel like if I were to try and recreate it now, it just wouldn't be right. So let that be a lesson to always record everything when you're working on stuff, because you should, absolutely. If you're just going to start messing around and make sure everything's working, if you're doing an input check, just hit record before you start, because you'll regret it if you don't. I am the example there again. So yes, I also applied some pitch shift via Neptune to these vocal parts as well, in an attempt to try and make them sound a little less grainy, but it just didn't really work for me. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if that's entirely because of the vocals or because I'm using the RV7000. And I love the RV7000 to bits, but in retrospect, like, I mean, it's based on DSP that was written in like 2003, so I mean it's understandable that in some instances it's showing its age a bit, but I still really like it and I do still use it sometimes. But I feel like if I were to use a DR1, that would possibly cover up my mistakes a little better. Well, not mistakes, but the fact that it doesn't sound anything like a female voice. So I'm just going to try that for argument's sake here. And interestingly, it only routed one output, so I'm just going to... Yeah, so already I feel like that kind of works a bit better, so that's super interesting. Someone's pointed out, I think the latest version of Cubase has a feature where it records live channels in case you forget to arm the channel. Yes, and I think Live does that now as well, which is super useful, and I would love to see that becoming a more standard thing. I remember with the Balance audio interface with Reason, it had a clip safe mode which you could enable, so that if you recorded something and it clipped while you're recording it, it would record 2 copies of that particular recording, so you could switch to the one that's attenuated and it wouldn't clip, and that was incredibly useful. And again, that kind of feels like the kind of thing that I really wish I'd sort of caught on with other devices, really, because that's a super useful feature to have. So yeah. So yeah, there's quite a few things I would absolutely change in this track, and putting in some actual live instrumentation I think would make a big difference here outside of the vocals. And you know, I also did a bunch of other stuff, like I removed some breaths on vocals. Like I've got like a laundry list of tweaks that I made to this track, but none of them are particularly exciting or, you know, super crazy. But like when you bring them all together, it just kind of gives everything a more polished sound. So I also, one of the things I did change was originally I didn't have the 4 millisecond look ahead enabled on the soft clip on the maximizer on the drums. So the drums were actually clipping in the original version of the track, which was interesting because I haven't had that problem when I've been using, because I tend to use the kilohertz limiter in most of my other stuff. So yeah, just remember to turn on the 4 millisecond look ahead when you're actually bouncing your stuff, because that can prevent stuff from clipping, and that's where you want to be, really. So yeah, so everything's, one thing I should mention is everything from these sessions is it's all bounced out, and I've got stems for everything ready to go. That's something I do absolutely now all the time nowadays, religiously. If I'm working on something, I will always bounce stems, because you never know when you're going to want to come to something later on. And I've had issues in the past where people have asked me for stems for particular things that I've worked on and not had them to hand immediately. I had one particular instance where I wasn't here, and someone asked me for some stems to send to a client because they wanted to work on something I'd written, and I didn't have access to anything. Handily, I have a cloud backup of everything, but I only had the Reason file backed up, so I had to borrow someone's laptop, install Reason on it, get all my rack extensions synced, grab the project file, which didn't have all of the samples I needed, but it had enough to kind of get away with it. This was before VSTs were introduced, so there was a lot of audio. If it was after VSTs were introduced, I would have been screwed. So always, I'd say it's a good idea to keep as many recordings of all your stuff as possible. When it comes to stems, I tend to compress them as FLACs, so that, because stems have a lot of silence, if you're like me, and you use individual tracks for like one-off kind of one-shots here and there. So yeah, so I thought flacking them makes sense because it just chops out all the silence and compresses it, and it's lossless, so it's super useful. So so basically record as much as you can and keep everything archived. I would highly recommend doing that because it's a good habit. I'm really glad I got into that. So yeah, so I didn't really change a whole lot else, but someone mentioned there was like a little base rise thing in here, but I can't remember what that is. What did I use for the sweeps? Was that just... Oh, that was the bird. Yeah, I forgot what I used. So Trevor has said, I was just chastised by someone I was working with for my shoddy backup scheme. Yeah, I am pretty anal about that kind of stuff now. I have an online backup with CrashPlan, and I have a couple of local backups here. So I tend to think of it as kind of an insurance policy for irreplaceable data, really, because once upon a time I ended up losing about a decade's worth of photos, which wasn't the end of the world, but it's stuff that's irreplaceable. And ever since then I've had to kind of beg and borrow from friends to see if they've still got those photos, and it's just, I'm annoyed that I accidentally got rid of those. So back your stuff up, even if it's not, if you don't think it's super important, it's good to have this stuff backed up, because when it's gone you're going to miss it. So yeah, got a little philosophical there for you. So that's Phoenix Sunrise. So interestingly, the next track was Inhale, so I'm going to open that up now. So this was written on the 14th of May, so we're in May now. Oh yeah, Phoenix Sunrise was written on the 7th of May. So yes, I'm just going to close that, maximize that. So anyone else wishes that Splice would integrate with Reason? I've actually used, I had like a few months free subscription with Splice, because I bought a Scarlett 4i4 relatively recently, and I thought it was, it's neat, but I feel like if you're going to be using Splice a lot, then you're going to, well, I prefer to buy sample packs. So yeah, because I'm kind of crazy about my organization. I like to keep things individual. Oh man. Ash230492 has said, my entire 1 terabyte hard disk crashed. That is rough. Oh, sorry to hear that. Have you used the shimmer reverb on process pianos as an insert or send? I haven't, but I'm going to now. Right. To be honest, I haven't really used process pianos a whole lot. It's one of those rack extensions I haven't really touched. So I'm just going to fire up an instance and play with it since you suggested it to me. And then I'll start talking about this track because I do like a good segue. So, process pianos. Is it here? No, it's here. I thought I had process pianos installed. Am I just being blind? That's really strange. Okay, maybe I don't have process pianos in that case. Damn it. Well, in that case, I definitely haven't used the shimmer reverb because I haven't got it installed or activated, which is irksome. It could just be that I haven't actually got it activated, but that's unlike me. So yeah, I'm going to have to investigate that, but it could just be that I don't actually own it, although I did think it came with Suite for some reason. But anyway, I'll look into that and I'll check it out. In fact, I'm going to make a note of it because I want to check that out now. Process pianos shimmer. I noticed someone mentioned the reverb on the Complex one on Reason Talk recently. So it comes with 11 Suite. In that case, I must have just deactivated it because I wasn't using it. So maybe I'll find a new use for it now. But yeah, you can use the Complex one as if you route something into the input. So let's have a subtractor and route that to the input of this Complex one. So lovely. So if I just route that in there, it's not going to play anything because it's not routed correctly. So I'm sort of regretting doing this already. The problem is if I start messing around with Complex 1, I kind of get sucked into a bit of a rabbit hole. So anyway, external I/O. So if I have audio input 1 and audio input 2 and route those to the output mixer. So there we go. So that's now the subtractor is going through the Complex 1's reverb section, so you can use that as a delay unit. And again, it's kind of a nice example of being able to do stuff in Reason. The Complex 1 isn't supposed to be used as an effects unit, but you can use it. Unfortunately, it only has, if you're going to start messing around with stereo signals, then, I could just Oh, this is going to get confusing now. I'm just going to leave this for now. But yeah, it works. So yeah, you can use all of these. And yeah, someone just mentioned that they particularly liked the reverb in complex. So I thought I'd just kind of show that off. And I mean, it is quite nice, and now I feel like I want to use it a little bit more because reverb's always good. So anyway, so I'm just going to get rid of that stuff. And you can also route audio into Complex One a whole multitude of other ways and use it as an external signal source with everything else, and it's awesome. I feel like one of these days I'm going to have to start a track using just Complex One because that is fun. I mean, I did that with one of my earlier live streams when I had a patch from my good pal Tom Pritchard sent over a complex patch, and it's awesome. And yeah, anyway, so this track is Inhale. So I'm just going to play the track from start to finish and talk a bit about it and kind of go into it really. So yeah, here we go. So that was Inhale, which was written on the 14th of May. And I feel like that's kind of an interesting one because it's a bit of a segue between, well, kind of a middle ground. I keep saying segue. I feel like that's kind of become my word at the moment. It's kind of a middle ground between using entirely factory-based, sort of factory sound bank samples and stock instruments and stuff. So I've used stock drums here, which I feel like it still kind of you can tell that it's using stock drums because it kind of still has that sort of older feel to it, and I think the individual drum hits kind of lend themselves to that, which is super interesting actually. Whereas I've actually used a bunch of external samples for other stuff, and as someone correctly pointed out, this was the introduction of the beard scratch, which was, for anyone who wasn't there during the stream, I decided to add some percussion by scratching my face, which was kind of funny. So in the context of the track, you can't really tell that's me scratching my face, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I love creating individual kind of loops and samples, just using stuff that I happen to have lying around. It's just kind of how I work. Like for ages I was using the sound of a bin lid closing to create sweeps. Now I've started just sniffing, which is appropriate considering the fact that this is called Inhale, snorting. So yeah, so I fully intend to use the beard scratch more often. So if you listen to any of my tunes outside of the streams, you're going to have to keep an ear out and see if you can spot the weird sounds that I'm making with my face. So Drabbits asked if I used the groove mixer for the offset claps, and I absolutely hit it. I did do that here, and it's a trick that I use all the time, and I feel like it bears repeating, kind of going over here. So on this redrum channel, you notice there's two sequencer lanes, one for most of the drums and one for the claps. So I'm just going to play the claps individually. So it's just, you know, a single clap. But what I've actually done is I've used, if you look at this little part here, so you can select groove mixer channels on each sequencer lane, which is what these little drop down dealies here refer to. So this one is set to groove mixer channel A2, which is labeled as slide minus 52. So if we open up the groove mixer at the bottom, what I've actually done here is I've just set the slide here to minus 52 ticks. So what that means is every single note that's going through that sequencer lane is going to be brought forward 52 ticks, which is why you kind of get how you get this kind of sort of offset clap sound. So together it sounds like this. So if I disable that, it doesn't, the timing's completely off. So if you set it correctly, it works. I think what I also did is I introduced some random timing on this channel as well. So I clicked on edit here, and there's an extra random element of 12 ticks. So not only is other claps being brought forward, easy for me to say, by however many ticks it was, like 50 ticks was it? 52 ticks. There's also an extra 12 ticks of random timing, so every single clap is played at a slightly different timing, which kind of gives it a bit more of an organic feel, I think, which is really neat. Buskin Bills has asked, do you commit the groove to channel? I don't actually. I just leave it as it is. That's one thing I actually really like about the groove mixer, is that it's completely non-destructive. So if I decided at a later date I wanted to sort of increase the offset, I could just drag that down, and there we go. It's a more pronounced effect. In fact, I kind of like it like that, and I sort of wish I'd done that. I'm just going to listen to that as it is. I actually really like that extra slide now, so there we go. Never mind. So again, that just kind of highlights why it's a good thing to be working with non-destructive tools. If I want to make a change in the future, I can. So you can do, back in the day when I was using Cubase SX, I think, I was using the logical editor to manually apply random timings to sequencer notes, which kind of gives it does a very similar thing, but it's completely destructive. So once you apply those timing changes, that's it. It's in the channel. So you can't really change them particularly easily if you decide you want to mess with them in the future, besides creating a copy of the sequencer track beforehand, which is what I used to do. So yeah, I feel like the groove mixer it's kind of one of those overlooked features and reasons. It's not really talked about a whole lot now, but I find it quite invaluable for stuff like that. I think it was introduced in Reason 4, so it's been around for a while, and it's really, really good. So yeah, so once again here, so if I turn up the M-Class maximizer to how it was before, I think what I tend to do is have like quite a big input gain and a little output gain. So if I go to the busiest part of the track, not that it's particularly busy, you'll see it kicking in. actually, I'll just adjust that. Oh, stream, Bill's just asked, Busker said, man, stream just froze me. Anyone else having issues? It looks like it's working here, so, that sucks. Yeah, sorry, I need to find a... So there we go, the limiter just kicked in there. But yeah, so in this instance, I haven't really, it doesn't apply a lot of limiting to the track because there's not really a lot going on. And I was kind of using my ears here and just realized that, oh yeah, it sounds fine compared to everything else. So I just decided to leave it really. Yeah, so it looks like the stream's working for everyone else, which is a relief on my end, but it sucks for Buskin Bills. So sorry about that. Hope you get it working again soon. So yeah, so again, I've done a very similar thing here with the maximizer. I just literally went to the mixer and just brought up all the mixer channels until that sort of kicked in just a little bit on the maximizer there. So it's kind of a very rough way of getting things going. And then I started messing with the individual levels and what have you. So things I would change. I mean, to be honest with you, there's not really a lot I would want to change about this track. Originally I was going to say it'd be quite nice to change the drum hits to something that were kind of maybe less obviously reasoned. Maybe I'd change the kick, but I actually kind of like that particular sound in this instance, and it works nicely. I know the vinyl crackle was a bit of a divisive issue for some people, and again here I've used that weird factory soundbank bird thing, so I'm just going to have to find the sample in the factory soundbank and play it myself because I need it. There we go. So yeah, and I've used that as like a kind of stretched riser thing here, which was kind of funny. So yeah, so there's lots of vocal washes here. I think this is also one of the tracks where the vocal parts worked really well. I think it's, you know, form and shifted. I'm just going to let that play out. Someone tried to trigger the factory soundbank bird sound, so I thought I'd do it manually instead. So just one for luck. Excellent. It's going to get old if I have to just keep flipping over to the browser to manually trigger these samples. I really need to fix that for next week because I suck and I meant to do it this week. So yeah, I was really happy with how those vocal parts turned out. So again, like those were just... I think what I did this time was I transposed the entire track up 3 semitones and then recorded them and then brought them down. So that was kind of interesting, and I've done the old form and shifting trick with Neptune again. And someone commented on one of my YouTube videos that I could have just adjusted the formants form and shifted the vocals using the pitch editor in the sequencer itself, which I could do, but I feel like I'm more familiar with the how the form and shifter works on the Neptune, so I just use that in this instance. But there's nothing stopping you from doing it either way. This is just an example of kind of me doing things a weird way because I just happen to prefer it really. So yeah, so that actually worked quite nicely, and that's definitely something I'm going to be doing again, just kind of bumping the track up a few semitones, then recording the vocals. So just for the sake of this, if I just solo that one vocal channel. So originally it sounded like, well, that's what it sounds like in the track. So if I just disable stretch on that and set transpose to 0 and disable the Neptune, yeah. As Travis points out, the pitch editor will do it too clean, if that makes sense. Yeah, so again, that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to do it with Neptune. I was kind of more familiar with the results I'd get out of it. So yeah, that's how the vocals started before I started messing around with form and shifting and transposing them. And I think it's much more pronounced on the second channel, where I've just taken the exact same take and brought it up an octave. So... But if you don't form and shift it, then I seem to recall that sounds kind of goofy. I had no idea how much that DR1 was adding to that particular channel there. So yeah, that was a nice experiment, and I feel like kind of those little vocal parts have become a bit of a kind of calling card during these live stream sessions. And in fact, that's one thing I probably would change about Phoenix Sunrise, is adding some live instrumentation. It would have been cool to stick some vocals in there, because I don't think I did. No, I did. What am I talking about? I added the Humana over the top. So yeah, ignore that. I added vocals and they sucked, so I'd re-record them. That's what I'd do. So yeah, that was interesting. So there were lots of little changes that I made to this track again. So it's I think I added like a bunch of fades just to kind of keep things a bit smoother. And again, one particular problem I tend to have working on headphones during these streams is that I tend not to notice when the percussion is sounding a bit too harsh. So a lot of the time the shakers tend to sound quite scratchy when I'm working on them with headphones. So I tend to have to correct that after the fact. And I'm pretty sure in this instance I just brought them down. But several times now I've had to stick an EQ on them, which has done the job. So there's quite a bit of heavy EQing going on here in the drum section here, which is interesting. I'm not entirely sure why I decided to use the PEQ2 here, except probably for posterity's sake. I guess I'm using factory soundbank samples. I might as well use some odd Reason 1 devices there as well. So that was interesting. So yeah. I think that's pretty much the main stuff. I really like the bass patch that I created for this one as well, and the saturation knob was a nice touch there as well. So I think that was Drabbit's suggestion, so thank you. Yeah, I really like how that sounded. It has that kind of sort of kick at the start of each note and sounds like this. So without the saturation knob, and with, it just adds an extra little bit of sizzle kind of in the higher registers, I think, well, higher frequencies, which it's nice. It just kind of gives it an extra little bit of presence. You probably can't really tell that much in the mix, but I can, so I know it's there and I like it. So yeah, and the beard scratch was, I just love how it turned out. But yeah, this was an interesting track because my original intention was to write something quite dark, and I kind of mentioned that earlier in the week. And ultimately, I think I ended up enjoying working on the track so much that it kind of lost a bit of that darkness, really, as I was working on it. Like, it's still kind of melancholy, but it's not like, I wouldn't say it's a dark track. I'd say it's more kind of introspective, that kind of thing. It still has kind of a nice laid back vibe to it. It's not, you're not going to listen to it and start questioning, humanity or anything like that. So yeah, although that's coming in a couple of songs time. So yeah, I really enjoyed working on that one, and I think it's got a nice kind of emotional weight to it. But at the same time, I had so much fun working on it. I feel like it kind of lost a bit of the darkness I was going to bring to it, it's interesting how these things kind of pan out, how your mood can kind of be reflected in the music that you're creating, even if you don't really want it to on a kind of more subconscious level. So that kind of went out the window with the next tune, which I'm going to be opening up, which is Sunset Waves. So interestingly, with all of these tracks, I've kept a copy of all of the changes that I made to the tracks after the stream. So with Inhale, the notes are like including really minor tweaks. There's 1, 2, 10, 11, 12, 13. So it's 13 individual things I changed in the track itself, including things like boosting the track, boosting individual channels, that kind of thing. With the next track, which is Sunset Waves, it goes on for pages. Like, I changed quite a lot the day after. Nothing super massive, but there's lots and lots of little tweaks. So I'm going to open that track now and play it. So this one was quite interesting. I think this is the point at which I just decided I was going to completely start using rack extensions and other stuff as well. And there's a couple of VSTs in there as well. So I feel like in future streams, I might start bringing in more VSTs, just because I feel like it'd be nice to mix things up a bit at this point. But I'd still like to keep using rack extensions wherever possible. But for things like delay and stuff like that, I feel like a delay's a delay. it's interesting. So Busker Bills asks, have you included your list of changes text in the Dropbox? I haven't, but that's not a bad idea. If I were to maybe tidy up this list, like right now it's literally just a notepad document with some really rough stuff in there, but yeah, I would be happy to type that up and, well, just kind of tidy it up and stick it in Dropbox. Had not even considered that. Unfortunately, I don't have notes for the previous 4 sessions, but I thought I'd keep these handy because it might come in useful. And I feel like going over the stuff I've changed in here, it kind of gives a kind of just a general view of what sort of things I would change when mixing things separately. So that's a really good idea, and I'm going to write that down before I forget. So that's Process Piano Shimmer I need to look into, and changes text. Cool, I like it. Just send it as is. We will all forgive you. I mean, I could. The main, like, it's not that's the issue. I think the problem is a lot of this doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's just I've written stuff like added static matched ramp and grain to suit. It's like even I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I'm sure in the context of the track it makes sense. So anyway, I am going to play this track, which is Sunset Waves, which was originally started off as like I just wanted to write something kind of prog housey and more summery, and it ended up being like a 7.5 minute tune, which was kind of funny. So I'm just going to play this through, and if you have any questions or anything you'd like me to look into afterwards, please let me know via the chat, and I'm just going to play this through. Here we go. So that's Sunset Waves, and it was really cool seeing the chat while playing that. This song needs a video, which I've unfortunately my video editing skills are pretty much non-existent outside of just kind of putting together little tutorial videos and stuff like that. So yeah, I'd love to, but I don't have the skills necessary for that. But you can, as I mentioned before, you can check out all of the tunes that I've written during these sessions. They're available in a Dropbox folder, which is either in the Twitch chat somewhere or it's in the description in YouTube. So go there, you can grab the projects, you can grab the MP3s, you can grab the WAVs if that's your cup of tea. But all of the exports that are in that folder comes directly from Reason. There's no additional processing or anything like that. There was some question as to whether I'd touched them up using the analog heat or something like that, but no, those have just come straight from Reason. I would love to have a go at these tracks with the analog heat at some point and see how they sound, because I bet they would sound pretty good. But yeah, I'm really, really happy with how this track turned out. And it's kind of interesting how I was just talking about how I really, really love Valhalla delay, when I think this track has my favorite kind of delay, kind of washed out delay part in any of the live stream tracks I've done so far. So on the ARP section, which I've just soloed, there's a really cool kind of there's a really cool kind of feedback wash, which I'm just going to play now. I really liked how that sounded, and that's all the echo going on there. I've just kind of automated the feedback knob there, so I just cranked that right up and started messing around with the filter while that's playing as well, which I really liked. I think I adjusted the diffusion as well, which kind of gives it that more kind of smeared out sound. So it's interesting that I was just sort of talking about how much I like Valhalla delay, but actually I do still use the echo. It's really good for stuff like that. So yeah, so that was kind of a nice little aside, really. So one thing that I did change in this track immediately when I listened to it the following day was I didn't realize when I was working on this on cans at the time, but the kick in the original stream was incredibly weak, because all I'd done was if I go to the redrum here, I'd taken the kick. I mean, at the moment it's still not, I think, the length, it's not playing the entirety of the kick, but before it was like really short, so I think it was like, which is kind of weak source, when the entire sample sounds like, it's like it was missing most of the weight. So I kind of met it in the middle, really, and I think the track sounded a lot beefier for it. It was interesting because I had no idea that was the case when I was actually working on it in the during the stream. I just assumed it sounded fine. So that was really interesting. I also made a couple of arrangement tweaks to the track. So originally I had something different going on when the vocals came in with the bass note. Like, I think I had some static bass notes, but they just weren't really doing it for me. It just kind of took me out of the track a bit. So I went back to kind of playing the same pattern. So originally it was just playing that one static F, and it just didn't really work for me. It just sounded a bit weird. So I changed that. But again, when I was working on the track, it sounded fine. If I were to change anything in this track now, I was vaguely toying with this idea at the time when I came back to it the following day. But I like the kind of super saw pad, but I do kind of feel like the track sort of, something about it kind of falls apart around this point. Like, I really like how it progresses and all that stuff, but there's something about the production that doesn't really sit with me, and I think it is that super saw pad. So one thing I was vaguely toying with the idea of was replacing it with a virus pad, because it's great for that kind of thing, and I think it would really work there. It's not to take anything away from the Antidote. I think it's just because I put together the patch very quickly, and it's just a bit rough. But I think I made the phaser a bit more obvious here. So this is a good time to talk about another plugin I really like. So there's a free plugin you can get by Adam Szabo, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, which is called Phaser, which is basically an emulation of the phaser effect on the Virus TI. And I mean, you're probably thinking it's just a phaser. I mean, who the hell cares? You can get a phaser everywhere. But there's something about it that I really, really like. So I'm just going to play the super saw kind of pad patch with that turned on, just so you can kind of hear it. So it's kind of nice. I do like it, and it's a freebie, so you can check it out. He's also made a virus VSTI, which is called Viper, I think, which I've checked out, and it's good. I don't own it, but I've tried it out, and I don't know. It's not quite there, but it is a solid instrument as far as I can tell. So. Ash has asked, have you used Output Exhale? I have used Output Exhale, and I use it all over the place. In fact, I use quite a lot of output stuff all over the place. This is going to be my dipping into Kontakt libraries section. So when I'm working on my own stuff, I do tend to dip into Kontakt quite a lot. I just feel like during streams, it's not really demonstrating a lot if I'm just dipping into Kontakt to get ideas going. Although that said, I do love bass synth, and I fully intend to... Actually, I want to show something really funny because I thought it was funny. So there's a patch in bass synth, and it's just a default factory patch. I'm going to turn down Kontakt, and it sounds like this. Oh, it's muted. Right, so if I unmute that, what's soloed? There we go. Right, so it's a really beefy kind of cinematic sort of bass sound. So I was watching season 3 of Westworld when it aired over here, and I noticed a particular sound that kept popping up, and it sounded like this. So if you watch season 3 of Westworld, you will notice that because that exact patch, I am sure, pops up all over the place in season 3, which I thought was really funny because it's literally just a default patch when you open up Bassynth, but it sounds really, really cool, and that I'm not taking anything away from the music because the music in season 3 of Westworld is awesome, and I really liked most, the kind of aesthetic choices were just outstanding. Loved it. The music's excellent, but I just thought it was really funny, and my wife didn't really understand why I thought it was so funny that I kept hearing this thing popping up, and I was like, it's just the preset from Bassynth. So there we go. So that's Bassynth. I use that a lot. So I got Exhale further down here. So Exhale is an instrument by Output, and it's pretty nifty. Although, to be honest, I tend to use it less than the other Output devices for some reason. So yeah, it's a really nice rompler. I basically picked up all of the Output stuff in a bundle, which is pretty much paid for itself instantly. It was really, really good. I tend to use Noir as my main piano nowadays because it sounds really, really, really nice. I did use Radical Piano for years and years. Then I started using Una Corda, which is another Native Instruments Kontakt library for a bit, and then I switched pretty much exclusively to Noir just because it suits pretty much everything I work on. And I've got the P4 drums, which are awesome. I've got a nice acoustic drum setup now, which is something I've struggled with for years. Acoustic drum mixing is not my forte. Like I've been kind of passable at it before, but P4 is really, really good. Ash has said India. Yeah, that's I think that comes with Complete, which is neat. Forgot that was going to be incredibly loud. I wish there was a standard with sample libraries and synths in general, like presets, where everyone would adhere to the same level of patches and presets, because it annoys me when I'm going through libraries, even within the same sound library, where the volume will vary wildly between patch. It's infuriating. It really annoys me, and I always appreciate it when library manufacturers or creators actually volume match their patches. It is appreciated. So so I'm going to close that and fire up a sitar, because why not? So yeah, it's neat. Anyway, I'm going to stop messing around with Kontakt libraries. I've got a few that I dip into. Signal is incredibly useful for kind of arpeggiated patterns and sequences and that kind of thing. So, well, now you got to buy a sitar. No. So I use Strummed Acoustic, which is another Native Instruments library which came with Complete. I use that if I'm working on something quickly and I don't have time to record acoustic guitars. I'll just throw that into a track, and that does a really good job of kind of padding stuff out. So yeah, it's really, really good. And maybe I'll dip into this stuff in future streams, because there's stuff in there that I use quite a lot. And it's got the full fat version of Drumvolution, which is excellent, but I tend to just use the samples nowadays in Redrum. Drabbit has said, I thought it was standard for all British musicians at some point you buy a sitar. Well, it hasn't happened yet, but never say never. For ages, one of my relatives was badgering me to pick up a bouzouki, which I don't really understand the reasoning behind that. I mean, you saw me last week. I struggle to play a regular 6-string guitar as it is. Why do they think it would be a good idea for me to get a bouzouki? I have no idea. It's a nice instrument, though. I do like the sound of it. So I have a massive list of things I changed in this track. So a lot of it is really mundane stuff, but the kick is a big one in particular. And again, a lot of the percussion in this track was kind of scratchy originally, but the main thing I would change here would be that the end section it needs a bit more going on. And also, I think I got a bit lazy with the stutter edits and kind of repeated patterns repeatedly throughout. I mean, to be honest, using stutter edit as it is kind of lazy. So I feel like I was extremely lazy by just unmuting bits. But by the end of the track, I mean, it was getting to 7.5 minutes, and I was like, okay, I should probably be wrapping this up. So that thought didn't really cross my mind at the time. But one thing I really liked about this track was the ARP itself, which is, the thing that plays throughout. Oh, that's right, the delay is still cranked right up. Yeah, not to take away from stutter edit. I try not to use it too much now, because as an effect, I kind of feel like for the most part, it is kind of played out at this point. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I feel like it was kind of played out by about 2010. I think BT did a pretty magnificent job of running that effect into the ground with his material on its own, to be perfectly honest. But as an effect, I still think it has uses for kind of just spicing things up a little bit. And it's one reason why I try not to use it too often in my own stuff, because I'm slightly afraid that it's going to date my stuff terribly if someone comes back to it in like sort of a few years or something. They'll be like, oh, it's stutter edit, how very 2010, which is kind of interesting, because it was, I mean, approximations were all over the place in the noughties and well, the 2000s generally. So yeah, so I try not to use it too much, but as an effect, it has its uses, and in this track, I think it did a great job and kind of fit the style quite nicely. So yeah. But yeah, I think I would change that super saw pad. I mean, it does the job, and I think it's kind of a testament to Antidote that I was able to throw it together so quickly, because it works. So yeah, it's good. Oh yeah, Buskin Bills has said a bit like Endless Smile. Yes, I remember when Sausage Fattener was a massive thing, sort of, again, was it like 10 years ago or something? And I remember my friend showing it off to me at the time, and he was like, for some reason, it just makes things sound great, and it has a super goofy interface, and I could see the appeal of it, but I never picked it up myself. I wasn't sold on the idea. But yeah, Endless Smile seems to be another plugin by Dada Life that just kind of seems to be all over the place in EDM production now. It's like, I like things that do one thing in particular and do it incredibly well, but once it starts popping up in everything, I feel like it's a bit played out, which is kind of funny when I'm sat here talking about how I put together a super saw pad, which is one of the most played out things in sort of trance and sort of housey music in general. But there we go. I am always kind of dubious about adding pads like that to anything that sounds even remotely trancey, because again, I feel like it's a bit cliched at this point. But one of my favorite albums is Air Drawn Dagger by Sasha, and I think it's on the second track. It uses a really nice kind of super soul pad, and it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't sound cliched at all. It fits the track perfectly, and I love it. So that's kind of my excuse. If he can get away with doing it there, maybe I can get away with doing it myself. Not that I would ever compare myself to Sasha, because his music's awesome, and Scene Delete is one of my favorite albums of the past 10 years already. But there we go. As Drabbit has pointed out, with dance music you kind of have to lean into some of the cliches. That is true, that is very true. But yeah, I kind of feel like with Endless Smile, it's getting to the point now where you can just spot it a mile off. I feel like that's sort of the case with Stutter Edit now, and that's kind of why I try not to use it too much. But there we go. I did use Buffer all over the place when that was first introduced to Reason, and now I've got to a point now where I listen back to that stuff and I'm like, yeah, I overdid it. But there we go. So yeah, I think I don't think this track uses disperser, which is something I was going to mention as well. So disperser is an effect that I've been using on my drums quite a lot to kind of give the kicks a bit more sort of weight behind them without actually compromising the mix. And I'll go into that when I get into the next track. So with the Super Saw synth, another thing I did as well. Oh yeah, there's a Nostromo. I need to use that some more. With the Super Saw synth, I did create an instance of the MP5 again, and I've done the same trick where I've just smoothed the highs using the 20k attenuation here. So there's something about that EQ that just kind of does when you smooth the highs, it just sounds really nice. Whereas if you use sort of other types of other EQs, it either sounds like it's too extreme or it's not smooth enough. Something about just being able to throw that into a track and just dial that in and know that it's just going to smooth things out nicely. I really, really love that about it. And it's interesting because I've had the MP5 for years and years, but it's only really the last couple of years where I've actually started to use it much more. So the high boost I tend to use around 12k on a lot of things just to kind of cut through the mix. And you know, it's just little things like that really, and it's just a great little EQ. So I'm thinking if there's anything else I badly need to go into in this particular track. I did the same thing with the vocals again here, so it's formant shifted low and higher vocals. So if I solo those again, where are they? So someone pointed out that actually I'll get rid of that sitar track. Someone pointed out while the track was playing that there's 16 tracks in this particular tune, and there's 3 of those are vocal tracks, and one of those is a riser track. So 4 tracks dedicated to vocals and effects. So the rest of it is just kind of stuff, important stuff. One thing I did add after the live stream was this drop kick, which I'll just play. Can't actually find it now. So where is it? I know it was during oh, there it is. So originally there wasn't a drop kick, so yeah, it just sounded a bit underwhelming when it kind of got to that section. There was nothing to kind of signify that it was a bit of a breakdown, so I just decided to add that drop kick and just kind of gave it a bit of weight. But as far as I'm aware, it's just a simple kick going through a DR1 and a filter, I believe. Oh, there it is. So it's going through an ECF42 simple kind of low pass filter, then it's going through a DR1, just kind of give it a nice big bit of space. For some reason, I used to really struggle with doing those kind of drop kicks in older tunes. I'm starting to think maybe it was something to do with the kicks that I was selecting as samples, but that wasn't a problem here. It did the job, and it kind of washes out nicely, so I just decided to leave that as it was. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Another trick that that was another thing I was going to touch upon here is so I've used groove mixer channels here in this particular track, but you probably haven't noticed any obvious sliding drum hits. So I'm just going to play a little bit of kind of typical bit of drums from this track. He says, forgetting that it's washed in reverb, right? So really simple, without any of the tops or anything like that over the top. It just sounds kind of very steady. But one thing I did on a couple of these channels, so that's like a transient for the snare, and that's the snare itself. So those are both assigned to two different groove mixer channels, and I've realized if I'm going to be having the snare playing at the exact same time as the kick, then those two hits are going to be fighting for the same space at the exact same time. If you have two drums with transients kicking in at the exact same time, then you're in for a bit of a world of hurt in terms of keeping a mix under control. So what I tend to do in that kind of situation is I'll just apply a very, very, very slight slide to individual hits that have transients that might be playing at the same time. So the snare is slid kind of very slightly before the kick, and the kind of extra layer on top of the snare is kind of slid just a little bit after. So they're not all playing at the exact same time. You can't really tell when you listen to them in sort of together. They all sound like they're playing at the exact same time, but that tiny slide is just enough to give the mix a bit more breathing room, which is incredibly useful. So this is one of those tricks that is kind of imperceptible unless you're not using it. So if I go back to the rack view and leave that playing, so you can see the limiter's kind of kicking a little bit on those channels. So if I were to remove those groove mixer channels entirely, I would imagine they'll kick in quite a bit more. Or not. So that's completely undermined everything I was just saying. But I feel like it's a good habit to get into. If you're going to have drums with sharp transients playing at the exact same time, do spread them out. I would suggest doing that. Just gives you a bit of extra space to play around with. But oddly in this instance, because the snare isn't really particularly low, mid, heavy, it's not really competing with the kick. So I've kind of talked myself out of this demonstration here. But anyway, here's some bongos. Right. So yeah, that's pretty much. Oh, I didn't realize I actually added the phaser to the super saw pad because that wasn't there originally. So I think originally I also kind of thought that super saw pad was quite static, so I decided to add that sweeper to it after the fact. So I'm going to move on to the next track, which is the final track from last month, really. So it's the one I wrote last week, which was called Memories Evolve. So I'm going to open that up now. Anyway, here's some bongos, new stream title. I'm totally going to make a note of that. Anyway, here's some bongos. Right, okay. Yeah, I figured I could kind of distract everyone from the nonsense the fact I was talking myself massively out of the point I was trying to make with some bongos. If that didn't work, then damn it. So this is Memories Evolve, which is the track that I put together last week. So I'll just play that through from start to finish, and I will talk about that, and again talk about things I would change or things I would have done differently. So yeah, I'm totally gonna have to start using anyway. Here's some bongos as a catch-all for everything. It works for any situation. Trouble at the bank? Anyway, here's some bongos. Girlfriend left you? Anyway, here's some bongos. Yeah, gonna have to start adding bongos to the chat commands once I get that back up and running. So yeah, here is Memories Evolve. This is the track that I wrote last week, and here we go. So that was Memories Evolve, and here's some bongos. Damn, I don't have any bongos handy. Yeah, so some interesting comments during that. That guitar was a great addition. Yeah, I'm really happy with how that turned out, although I really wish... So a bit of background. During the stream, because this was recorded last week, I decided to get one of my guitars and play some bits over the top, including an EBow part and this picked part. So I'm just going to play that. So, I mean, I really like how that turned out. I got kind of lazy in terms of copy and pasting those guitar parts and editing the pitches in the sequencer, just because I wanted to wrap things up, because, you know, I'd been at it for a little while by that point. But annoyingly, when I picked up the guitar, I played like a little part over the top of it while I was setting my levels, and I didn't press record, and I'm really annoyed that I didn't press record, because I played something that I really would have liked to have used. So again, if you're just noodling, if you're playing, always hit record, make sure you've got stuff recorded. You can always get rid of it afterwards if you're not into it. But if you don't record it, then you're not going to get it. And as Buskin Bills pointed out, it was damn hot. Yeah, it was really, really warm last week. I really wish I've got an aircon next to me, but I didn't really want to use it, because all you would have been able to hear during the stream is the sound of that. So it wasn't great. But the EBow, I think, turned out quite nicely. I flubbed one note, but I ended up just kind of fixing that with by slicing it up in the sequencer, which it worked. And I do love a bit of EBow, so it was nice to bust that out again. But last week was an interesting one, because I'm really happy with how that track turned out. But towards the end of the stream, I really, really wasn't into it. I just wanted to wrap the tune up and get it done. Like, I got to the point where I started really doubting myself as to whether I'd actually written anything decent. And I seem to recall I called it at the time that I was doubting myself. I'd listen back to it tomorrow, which was the day after last Friday, and I'd probably be like, oh yeah, this actually turned out really well and I'm happy with it. And that's exactly what happened. I came back to the track the following day and I was like, this is actually pretty solid. I really like how this turned out. So normally when you have, like, I'm sure everyone's gone through this, you have those moments where you're like, oh man, this song sucks, what am I doing? The best thing to do in that situation is to just leave it, go for a walk, I don't know, have a beer, do whatever chills you out, whatever. I'm not one to judge. And then come back to it with a fresh pair of ears, and then you'll probably come back to it and be like, oh yeah, this is really good. I just need to carry on. Although having said that, at the same time, there is always the danger where you do that and then you start overcooking a track. You start making little tweaks here and there that don't really amount to anything instead of actually finishing the track. So that's one thing I actually really like about doing these live stream sessions, is that it encourages me to get a complete tune done in a couple of hours, because I only have a couple of hours to do it. So it's, yeah, as Dravitt said, commit in the moment and sort it out later. That is a really, really good way of putting it. Just get your ideas down. You can always come back and edit your ideas. And that was that's generally how I work now. Is I really like getting a rough arrangement down, and then once that's down, you have a semi-complete track, and then you can start making all the crazy edits that are going to make you happy, because everyone loves crazy edits. I mean, I do. And the weirdest moments are when someone loves a track you absolutely hated when you made it. It's a weird feeling. Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting one. I had someone get in touch with me on Facebook about a tune that I wrote several years ago for a production album, and to be honest with you, I'm not massively happy with it. There are so many things that I would change now. But this person really loves it, and going by how many plays it's had on YouTube, like, other people really, really like this track, which is really bizarre because I really don't like it. And it's it's imposter syndrome at work, and it's super insidious. And I think that is a thing that a lot of musicians experience, imposter syndrome. And it's just a thing that happens. I think it's just something that creatives experience, and having mechanisms to kind of get yourself out of that mindset is always important. And I think having stuff like players is a really good way of getting ideas down. But there's always that kind of niggling feeling at the back of your head that's like, you didn't come up with this idea. You know, is this really your song? So again, it's just that kind of imposter syndrome, just kind of messing with you there. So that's actually kind of an interesting thing to talk about here, is because I've used a player here called Evolution, which I hadn't really used a whole lot up until this track, and I'm planning on using it a whole bunch now because it's awesome. So I was actually given this rack extension very kindly by Electric Panda, and I feel really bad for not using it sooner, really, because it's really, really good. So just to clarify, I haven't been kind of sponsored or anything by Electric Panda. It was literally a case of, here is the player, I hope you like it, kind of thing. So I haven't been paid outside of the player itself, but I really liked it, and it's kind of, I mean, this track basically came about because of that sort of key pattern, which is entirely generated by the Evolution and the VK2 rather, and both together with cassette and all this stuff, like it just basically wrote itself from that point. So Beatmap and Pulsar combined have been a lifesaver for this. Yeah, Beatmap has just been awesome. I've really liked using that. Trabbits asked how you implemented Pulsar in that. So I'm imagining, if I go over here, I imagine it's going to be something like this. So this is something that I've been doing a little bit recently myself as well. So what am I doing? So I have to combine it. I have to stick it in a combinator. But basically what I tend to do is create an instance of Pulsar, not Polar, which is, I can never find it when I want it. Where is Pulsar? Man, I'm feeling really stupid now. Oh, it's in utilities. Or is it in instruments? Oh, there it is. It was right there. So oddly, I actually use Pulsar quite a lot. I just had a massive brain fart and forgot where it was. So you can route Pulsar's outputs into the CV inputs on the back of Beatmap, X and Y, and then it will kind of steadily move the coordinates around on the Beatmap itself. So you end up with constant drum variations, which is really, really cool. I stopped using that during my streams because I wasn't entirely sure if that was causing the Beatmap to go out of sync. But it turns out the Beatmap just does that whenever the hell it wants to anyway. And I really should report that because it was happening when I was working on another track I was working on recently, and it was really annoying me. I had, like, it stopped doing it after a while. It was really odd. But yeah, that's a really nice way of just kind of introducing really subtle, if you just turn a level right down, sort of subtle variations to the beat map. It's a really cool trick. Yeah. And funnily enough, if you stick it inside a combinator, you can map it to the combinator CV inputs and then control the beat map directly, so you can see where the coordinates are going on the actual map itself, which is completely pointless, but it looks kind of neat. So I think that's how I was using it during some of my earlier streams. So yeah, so this it was an interesting track to work on. Like I'm really happy with how it turned out, but it was a bit of a slog to finish, to be perfectly honest. And some of the stuff, like the crackling synth, like I like how it sounds in the track, but I totally overthought that at the time. Like I think I spent way too much time working on that thing, and it's such a simple sound as well. But it's kind of easy to get sucked into those weird kind of creative rabbit holes when you're actually working on stuff. Like I'm sure there's a much more elegant solution to doing that than creating an OTT and a bunch of extra stuff over the top. I really did like the grain delay that was added to that, though. That was a suggestion from the chat, and I really appreciated that. And it was nice to use the respire in this track as well. I've just realized I've left the previous track open as well, so I'm actually kind of amazed that my computer didn't just freak out while I was like trying to play this track with another one in the background. So yeah. So again, I haven't actually used a whole lot of tracks here because I'm working on something in a couple of hours. I don't want to start overloading it with loads of stuff. And that's kind of interesting because how I used to work is I would get to a certain point in a track, and I still do this to a certain extent. I'd get to a certain point in a track and just be like, where do I go from here? Just add more stuff to it. And that's not necessarily a great way of working unless you can control what's actually going on. So yeah, so I think being able to control what's going on and having kind of a smaller track count is useful to kind of being able to keep tabs on everything that's going on. But if you're used to having hundreds and hundreds of tracks open all the time, then go for it. Just maintain some kind of organization, I think. Very interesting question. Have these streams had any effects on your non-stream music production? Yes, absolutely. So for a start, I've been using a lot more players in kind of getting ideas going. Again, I used to kind of have this thought at the back of my mind where I'd be like, can you really call it your idea if you're relying on players to get things going? And yes, you can, because you are the one who is coming up with an idea. One thing I really like about doing these streams is I feel like I can talk about what I'm doing, but nobody is going to immediately go out and write something that sounds exactly the same. And that's the same with everyone watching. You can follow everything I'm doing to the letter, and what you create will be a representation of yourself as a creative. You can't really help that. That's just something that happens. And I think there's a very weird attitude that everyone needs to be very guarded about what they're doing, in terms of sharing sort of techniques and stuff like that. And it's as Drabbit has just pointed out, fans don't care how you make it if they like it, players or not. And that is absolutely one approach. And it's just a weird kind of insidious thought that, like, once it kind of pops into your head, it just kind of sits there, and it's not good. But yeah, absolutely. I've started using more players, and I've started. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat. Can you play a song on Spotify? No, it's not really the kind of stream that I do. It was. I'm trying to think of other examples where things have kind of seeped into my regular music making. So I've been using a lot more players. I've been using VK2 a whole lot more because I hadn't really been using. I'd used that a bit before, but I hadn't really kind of jumped into it as much as I have recently with the streams. Something about it just kind of clicked during these streams, so I decided to just kind of run with it, really. So yes, that's kind of two big things, and the idea of just kind of getting ideas down quickly, and I think I started dipping more into sort of music with a 2000s kind of flavor during these streams as well, and that really kind of resonated with me at the time, because I've been doing a whole bunch of that since, and it's been a lot of fun to kind of, just as like a palate cleanser from working on production stuff with a kind of more modern feel, to dip into stuff that I personally just have a soft spot for and wanted to bust out. So it's I've a lot of kind of stuff seems to be kind of seeping into my regular stuff outside of the streams, which is really nice. So I'm hoping for my next set of streams to kind of maybe have more stuff from my regular music making find its way kind of more into my live streams kind of thing, share more between the two. So yeah. So that's pretty much all I really wanted to cover on with these tracks in particular. Like, I think I'm happy with all of those tracks. I think the one track that could have been that would benefit the most from added sort of changes in instrumentation and effects and stuff, and a bit of a fresh coat of paint, would actually be Phoenix Sunrise, because I feel like it just, like, that one it's the one that sounds the most like it was written by someone in a couple of hours in a hot room, whereas I feel like the other tracks, I feel like they stand up a bit better. So that's kind of interesting. I think a lot of that possibly has to do with the instruments I chose to use and the kind of reliance on factory soundbank stuff. I mean, I was going for a sort of early 2000s kind of vibe anyway, so I think I did kind of capture that, but I still think some extra live parts would help to bring it together without sounding quite as cheesy. But and Inhale, I'm really happy with how that turned out, and the same with Sunset Waves. I think Memories Evolve, like, in retrospect, I'm super happy with how that turned out. If I were to do this again, I would probably re-record the guitar parts, because it is kind of lazy how I've just copied and pasted everything. And the same with the vocals. Like, but again, if it sounds right, it is right, really. So, yeah. So, Drabbit said, if anyone has Sweet and wants to dump me a WAV of Inhale, I'll record some vocals for it. I've actually got these stems kicking around. If you... I'll upload those after the stream if you like, and I'll just throw you a link. So there we go. Let's get some collaborations going based on these tunes. That'll be kind of cool. That's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask me about these tracks or anything in particular, then now is the time. I think there are a couple of extra that I may have missed kind of earlier in the chat, But ultimately, I think if I'm struggling from now on, I just need to start saying, anyway, here's some bongos. So that's a really good question. Someone's asked in the chat, tip to the point, do you actually try to finish every song, or do you abandon ideas if you don't feel like it? I abandoned loads of ideas. I have folders full of archived stuff that I've never finished, and this is a really interesting rabbit hole that I'm about to go down. So I tend not to abandon ideas anywhere near as much as I used to, because I feel like if I abandon ideas, I'm more kind of the mindset now of I can get an idea, I can flesh out an idea into something useful more or less most of the time now. Sometimes I'll just be messing around for the sake of it, but that's kind of a different approach, really. The only exception to that now is I've got a folder full of like guitar riffs and stuff with acoustic drums, which I'm planning on dipping into to flesh out into a more coherent production piece at some point. But most of the time when I'm working on stuff now, I tend to finish it, or at least have a good stab at finishing it. I've become more forgiving in terms of I used to have this ridiculous idea that a song wasn't really finished unless it was a certain length of time, whereas now I'm okay to just be like, it's 2.5 minutes, it's done, move on. But yeah, I do have a massive archive of unfinished stuff, and one thing I'd recommend if anyone else is in the same situation, I would suggest bouncing all of those unfinished ideas to audio and just keeping them in a folder, because you never know, if you dip into it, you might come back. If you leave it as project files, you're much less likely to listen to your old ideas unless you commit and you're like, okay, I'm just going to dip in and listen to these. If you have them as audio, you can dip into a folder that's full of audio files and listen to those anytime. And I can guarantee you'll have some ideas which you'll come back to in like a year or two and be like, oh, there's something there, or there might be like a single part that you can use in another track that you're working on. So always keep those ideas, and I'd say render them to audio. That's an excellent idea. And I've got folders and folders full of stuff, like now dating back to like 2004 and stuff, and a lot of the stuff in there is kind of crap, and it's kind of fun to just go back and laugh at it. But there's some stuff in there where I'm like, wow, I really wish I'd finished that idea. So that's actually been an idea for a project of mine, has been to kind of take some ideas that are more or less semi-complete now and actually finish them off, and maybe give them an extra kind of coat of paint to just kind of touch them up and release them, really. So yeah, don't abandon old ideas. Render them to audio, come back to them later, unless they really suck, in which case stick them in the bin and set fire to the bin and throw the bin in the sea. Yes. Dravisar, since you're being way more open about your production, do you think there's anything that should be kept secret, or at least out of the stream? I mean, outside of like beta software. No, not really. No, to be honest, I can't really think of anything that I would do during a stream that I wouldn't be comfortable with sharing. Like, there's nothing I do in particular that would. My thinking has always been, like I said, I can show it. I could talk you through exactly how I put a tune together, and even if you were to follow it exactly to the letter, 100%, it's still invariably going to sound different to what I've done. Like, the reason the reason musicians are paid to kind of work on particular projects is because the person who's like the client who's paying them knows that they're going to turn out something that sounds like them, basically. And the more you fight that, the more kind of into a weird sort of knockoff kind of sound-alike hole you're going to end up. So I tend to find it's just kind of best to kind of roll with a natural sound. Like it's a tricky one, finding a sound that works for you and finding your sound. But yeah, Klobma said, I could say, here are all my current active non-disclosure agreements. Yeah, less of that. I don't know, really. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I can't think of anything I'd want to keep out of a stream besides me standing up and pulling down my trousers. But apart from full frontal nudity, I'm pretty okay with most things in reason. So most things within reason. Hey, no pun intended. Oh God. Right. More bongos in future streams. I'll be adding exclamation mark bongos. That is going in my notes. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, really. So I'm going to round off this particular stream here, and I'll stick around on Twitch for a few minutes afterwards if you're watching on Twitch. But if you're watching on YouTube, thanks so much for joining me and for listening to me waffle on about my stuff for a couple of hours. It's been interesting to go back over these projects, because I hadn't actually opened most of these since I created them. So it was interesting. So yeah, I'll stick around in the chat in Twitch for a little bit. But if you're watching this on YouTube, then thanks for joining me. Cheers and bye bye.